Penn's Village is a nonprofit organization based in Center City, Philadelphia. We are one of 3 villages in the greater Philadelphia area. There are nearly 300 villages across the country. We provide services and programs for older adults to enrich their lives. Among other things, our volunteers can provide rides to medical appointments and assist with home organization. We can help with errands and technology. We offer companionship and programs to educate and entertain our members. We have different levels of membership based upon your needs. I'll put our phone number and website on the screen so you can find out more about Penn's Village. Our program will begin shortly. You can call us at 215-925-7333. Our website is pennsvillage.org.
I'm Mark Raymond with the program committee. We have Margarita Abe, tech hosting today, who's co-chair of the program committee. And we have Brian Wengenroth, who is the board chair of Penn's Village. And for full disclosure, I'm also married to him. So if there's any preferences shown, you know why. Dr. Louise Hawkley, who leads research and analysis at the National Opinion Research Center that centers on identification of factors that increase risk for loneliness and the types of interventions that offer some benefits to lonely people. Dr. Hawkley's publications include more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. She is a co-investigator on the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, and a member of both the Gerontological Society of America and the American Society on Aging. We are very grateful and very fortunate that she has agreed to give us some of her time today. And Dr. Hawkley, please tell us anything else about yourself or the NORC at Chicago, and I will turn over the Zoom room to you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think I have anything to add. I'm just going to jump right in. I have not made loneliness front and center here. I've rather chosen to address this topic from the view of social connectedness and health, but you'll notice that the subtitle is Why Loneliness and Conversely Feelings of Connection Matter. So because there's a lot of research speak that goes on in this area, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page in how we understand terms. So for starters, what is loneliness? What is isolation? And that essentially defines what social connectedness is not. And briefly here, just by having a table, having the comparison side by side, what you can see is loneliness is subjective. You can feel isolated, even when you're not isolated, right? Social isolation, as the term, the way we use it, and we're studying it, it refers to actually being isolated in some fashion, either not having a lot of contacts or having very few interactions with people. So you can see I use this term low levels of contact. So it's a quantity measure. Loneliness, the technical definition, it's an unpleasant feeling that arises from a mismatch between what you want and what you actually get out of your social relationships. And usually it's a mismatch in the quality of your relationships. And as I said, it's distressing, unpleasant, whatever you want to call it, sad. Social isolation doesn't have to be unpleasant. People can choose to be alone. That's where the word solitude comes from. It's often selected because of some value that comes from having time to yourself, whether it's to be creative or to get a job done that you wouldn't be able to get done with interruptions. Whatever it might be, it can be chosen. Whereas loneliness, by definition, is not something people choose. And they tend to feel that they have no control over the circumstance and wish they did. And in fact, when we get to the point where we talk about interventions, they have more control than they think, or we have more control. I think one thing I should make clear at the outset, loneliness is not something that is only experienced by some people in our society. I think all of us have probably had times where we felt lonely. And oftentimes that resolves itself because we do take some step toward control, some step toward finding those relationships that we need or want to feel satisfied. And those two are very weakly related. This plot just shows you this very small wedge of relationship between loneliness and isolation. That becomes very important because when we study these, we want to know, is it really loneliness that's causing these health effects, or is it social isolation, or is it some combination? So let's start with loneliness, which is feelings of social disconnection versus connection. When we measure loneliness, the often used measure is something called the UCLA loneliness scale. The full scale has 20 items. For brevity, when we do large-scale national studies, we only use a 3-item version of it, and that's what you're looking at here. How often do you feel isolated? How often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? Each of those questions can be answered on that scale, from never or rarely to sometimes to always. And because we assign numeric values on those choices, we can derive a total score. And when you look at how that distributes in the population, you see that there are very few people at this low end. I mean, very, very many people at the low end, not very lonely, and very few people at the high end who are the most lonely. If you create a cut point, sort of arbitrarily put a break here and say, we're not going to count you lonely unless you have at least a score of 6 or more, then we say 30% of 57 to 85-year-olds were lonely in 2015 to 16. Most, 70% of people, were not lonely in that age range in that year. Just for reference, this was mentioned earlier, NCHAP, as we talk about it here, is the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, which is a panel study of older adults that began in 2005 and has been going on ever since. So initially we had the silent generation in that age range, and then in 2015 we introduced the baby boom generation, and we're tracking all of the survivors as long as we can continue to track them. You'll see this study come up again in some of the other data. When you look at men and women differently, just for your interest, and you look at the age distribution, you can see, well, let's start by just looking blue and pink. You can kind of ignore that. These are two different studies that show essentially the same pattern. So the pink is the health and retirement study, and the blue is this NCHAP that I mentioned earlier. In general, these curves tend to be higher. Women have higher loneliness levels on that scale. But what's common to both men and women is this, what we call a U shape. So from age 50 through to 95. Loneliness is actually decreasing with age until about 80 or so, before it starts increasing quite dramatically. And that's true in both men and women. We'll talk a bit more about that later. You can ask then, how much of a problem is it? That is, how prevalent is this problem? If you look at people who are 60 and older, anywhere between 2000 and 2019, across countries, United States had anywhere, depending on the study that data was coming from 10 to 18% of these 60 and older folks were lonely. In England, it was close, 9 to 19. Western Europe, quite a bit lower, at 11%. These countries included here, Belgium, France, Germany, Spain. The range there was from 8 to 14%. But then Eastern Europe, a whopping big 28%, where the range across countries like Bulgaria, Georgia, Poland, and Russia was anywhere from 13 to 43% of the older adult population claiming they were lonely, which is a sizable portion. And if you're talking about consequences, it's going to affect a large portion of the population. We've been tossing around, and the Surgeon General used the word epidemic. Epidemic, from statistical perspective and the way to talk about an epidemic, what it usually refers to is an increase in the proportion of a population that suffers from a certain disease. So, you know, maybe we had 10,000 people who were lonely in 2001, let's say, and we have 20,000 in 2020. Well, that's a big jump, but then so are the number of older people has increased a lot. So is it really a proportional increase? And this data suggests no. Between, I think here, 1996 to 2018, you're looking at two ways of looking at loneliness. This top plot shows just at a point in time, are you feeling lonely right now? The percentage went from 20% in 96 down to about 16% in 2018. If you look at what they called sustained loneliness, people who claimed they had been lonely or there was evidence that they had been lonely for a period of years, then you see from just below 5% here, 4.6%, down to 3.6% in 2000, not quite 2018, that's about 2015, I think it was. So there's nothing here that suggests that there is an increase. Now, these are not necessarily panel studies, so we're looking at a cross-section of people at each point in time. And so it's maybe not as accurate as you'd want if you were actually seeing what happened to people over time, the same people. If you just look at those who are living alone versus those living with others, the blue line is people living alone. Even among people living alone, that trend has gone down over time. If you do not live alone, it was always lower, less lonely if you live with someone, but that really hasn't changed over time. I should say that that's, as I said, that isn't a perhaps the best way of looking at proportion, but I can tell you that among older adults, we looked at that in NSHAP and found no evidence for a change in the rate at which people were getting lonely with age. What we saw was just an age difference. It didn't matter whether you were born in 1920 or 1950. By the time you reached 75, yes, I guess the boomers might have gotten that far, that's when you started seeing changes in loneliness. They were age related. They weren't related to when you were born, what you had as your childhood experiences. What about being isolated versus being connected? I talked about how those differ. If you're talking about measuring social isolation, the most typical measure includes a lot of things. I mean, how would you talk about isolation? You could say you live alone. Well, yes, so people live alone and have a very rich social life and see a lot of people and do a lot of things. That's not necessarily isolation. Some people are married and some aren't. It's kind of like living alone, but at least, you know, there's a partner. Oftentimes what's included in there are things like, how often do you talk with friends and family? Do you belong to and are you participant in any kind of groups? And religious service attendance. Do you attend? How often do you attend? And so they create a composite measure. So the lower your engagement in any kinds of social activity, the more you are considered isolated. And in this case, what we're looking at is an isolation score where here low numbers mean very isolated. And you see that about 14% of older adults were isolated in this period, 2006 to 10. Most people were pretty well connected, and some were very well connected. So again, there's this big distribution, and not everyone falls prey to being isolated or being lonely for that matter. What is happening in the way of how people are spending their social time? This is a really interesting set of data. This is called the American Time Use Survey, and it's been going on for years. Here you're looking at a bunch of plots. I'll just walk you through. Each individual block talks about a particular form of social activity and how it has changed between 2003 and 2019. And you do see a big increase in social isolation, meaning time spent alone. Even if there are other people around, you're not actually with them. Like you could be alone in the shopping center. There is a big 2020 bump here at the end, which we don't have to pay attention to because that's very specific to the pandemic. But even going up to 2019, and the general trend is we're spending more time alone. And this is across all ages. I'll give you an age breakdown shortly. Across all adulthood, time spent with the family going down. Non-household family, so this is in the household, people you live with, you're not engaging with them. What about family outside of the home? That kind of went through a little bit of a change and then has been dropping ever since about 2008 or 9. Friends, social engagement with friends, also a little bit of a dip, but then been going down ever since, even through to 2019. Engaging with others that don't fall into this family or friends category, or just being in the presence of a companion of any kind is dropping, has dropped a lot. This is really very colorful, and you don't have to pay attention to all the colors, but I did want to give you a little viewpoint about two groups: purple, which are the older adults, and blue, which are the young ones, 15 to 24 years old. You do see what we have seen with no change over time, that older adults spend more time alone than do any other age group. You do see kind of stable levels of engagement with the family in the household, but it varies by age, so that the younger set spend the least amount of time with family, which you can imagine are probably the kids who are going to school or spending a lot of time in extracurricular activities, so they're not spending a lot of time in the household. Non-household family engagement, this is where older adults, this purple line, is pretty high. They do spend quite a bit of time with family outside the house, and that hasn't really changed much until 2020. But from 2003 to 2019, it's just a very slight decline. And with this blue young group, it's kind of the same, but it's very jumpy, hard to make sense of. Friends. This is where young people are typically spending a lot of their time. And it's good that they do. This is how they create their social networks that follow them or go with them through life oftentimes. That has dramatically declined over time. And for older adults, the purple line, pretty stable, again, until we get to the pandemic. But right till 2019, it's very stable. Again, young adults don't spend a lot of time with others or with companions, and older adults, no change. They spend more time in companionship, but again, unless you count the pandemic, there hasn't been a lot of change there either. So there's not a lot of clear evidence for an increase in social isolation over time if you think of these types of social activity as marking engagement, with the exception of the younger group. And that's where I think the Surgeon General's report is very clear. And there was an earlier report as well from him regarding the mental health of our children, our students, essentially, children and young adults, adolescents, because of the growing problem of anxiety, depression, a lot of problems with that younger group that may be related to their activity. This is just showing differences between men and women. Not terribly surprising that we have women spending more time with the family than men. Same with non-household family and so on. So to the why should we care question, this is the health question. Here's a study from back in 2010. This was Julianne Holt-Lundstad with her colleagues, looking at a large number of studies, trying to get a single take-home message from these studies as to what effect, if you want to call it an effect, it's an association between one's social life and one's risk for early mortality. In this case, the flip side, odds of actually surviving longer if you had good social relationships versus less good relationships. And this second bar here highest versus lowest functional ties. So these aren't just, do you have people, but are they good people? Do you have good relationships with them? Are they supportive? And the point that she made in that paper was that these effects were as large, if not larger, than well-recognized health effects of smoking. This is just the contrast between light versus moderate smoking. If you are a light smoker, your odds of survival are better than if you're a moderate smoker. Well, if you're not a smoker, you can imagine that would be even bigger, but you still see a comparison that's not unlike, well, here's the stop versus continue. And same with BMI. There's a lot to say about the relative size of these effects to make you sit up and take notice and say, there's something going on here. We need to understand what it is about social relationships and social connections that somehow seem to protect us. This was the flip side 5 years later, where she looked at 3 specific measures of isolation. Loneliness, which is felt isolation. Living alone, which is a kind of a proxy, a single measure of what could be considered isolation. And then a composite measure of the type I talked about before. And these bars have slightly different lengths, but they were not what we call statistically different. So essentially, all 3 types of isolation increased your odds of early mortality. Also, social isolation takes a toll in terms of healthcare utilization. And this is where government comes in, because it's expensive to take care of all these health conditions. And socially isolated people cost. You get more hospitalizations among isolated older adults and older veterans. You get higher rate of hospital readmissions for people who are isolated versus not. Longer lengths of stay in the hospital if you're isolated. You visit the physician more often, and with both social and health goals. And this is something I read about recently, again, that physicians are seeing more patients come to them because they're isolated and lonely than they are because they have a health complaint. And this costs, as I suggested, Medicare spending. In a study done about 4 years ago, there was an estimated $6.7 billion annually spent on top of regular costs just taking care of the problems that came with being socially isolated. We know that loneliness, felt isolation, as well as actual isolation, but felt isolation in particular, has a very close relationship with cardiovascular disease. And here we're seeing some stats from, excuse me, a scientist from the UK who looked, again, in this, what we call a meta-analysis, looked at a large number of studies and kind of summarized the effect here. And you can see that poor social relationships increased risk of coronary heart disease by 29%, increased risk of stroke by 32%. That was true for both men and women. And she likened that increase to having a stressful job. And these are all studies that tend to happen in older adults. So perhaps there's a job underlying it, but over and above that, having poor social relationships is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease of these various types. There's also an association that's been established between loneliness and the onset of diabetes. This is a very fancy figure that the authors used to pose how that might be happening. One way might be that loneliness is causing people to become depressed, and we know that depression and its effects on sleep, and loneliness has effects on sleep. That might be what is leading to some of the intervening steps, like having an elevated blood sugar, having a bigger waist circumference, being more sedentary. That's what was driving type 2 diabetes. What they found is that people who, back in 1995, reported often feeling lonely, were 2 times more likely to develop diabetes over the next 20 years than those who experienced no loneliness. That's a big time gap in there, 20 years, what's happening in there? But that's what they're interested in pursuing and in understanding in their research. They also looked at metabolic syndrome, which is related, but that's things like high blood pressure, high levels of triglycerides and sugar, high, larger waist circumference, insulin resistance. That's called metabolic syndrome. And they found that that same situation, the greater the loneliness at the baseline, the greater the likelihood that they develop metabolic syndrome 20 years later. We've had some mention made of loneliness and dementia. A very serious outcome that we've had a large range of research done on this. In this case, I'm just informing you of these two particular findings. People who often felt lonely were more likely to develop mild cognitive impairment than those who rarely felt lonely. This is just graphically, stylistically illustrated here. It's not an actual brain, but the idea is mild cognitive impairment isn't full-blown dementia, but it is enough to affect one's life, at least to some degree, and it's a step on the way to a dementia. What was serious in terms of dementia was that was also a greater risk for lonely people, that they developed Alzheimer's dementia and other forms of dementia more often than non-lonely or less lonely people. So the degree of loneliness did seem to matter. What seems to be going on in this particular study is that there is something that, well, resilience can apply to a lot of things. Cognitive resilience is the fact that brains that look like there's a lot of damage may not actually be manifest in a person who's really seriously suffering from cognitive impairment. And so the degree to which you have some kind of resilience to these brain changes means that your loneliness is not going to have as big an impact on changes in cognition. And cognitive resilience comes from a lot of places, but one of the big things that helps create resilience in the brain is a sense of purpose. And I think some of you have talked about this just by virtue of being part of the village and feeling like there's a purpose in being there for each other is one of those mechanisms, I would argue. Problem is that lonely people tend not to be as resilient. So if you can counter it, the interesting thing is that getting a sense of purpose is not only good for protecting the brain, it also protects against loneliness. So that's, I think, another reason to tout the value of the village. Mental health, I've spoken about this already, that lonely people are more likely, this was something we saw in young adults in particular, but it's true across the board, they're more likely to become depressed, anxious, suicidal, have poor overall mental health, and less satisfaction with the overall quality of their life. Which in itself is worth noting. Things don't have to affect physical health and all the costs that ensue for it to be considered important. And I think this, although there certainly are costs, is itself a serious cause for concern. Loneliness has been associated with health behaviors, and let me tell you, they're not healthy behaviors. Typically, lonely people aren't as physically active. They are the ones who are more likely to develop disability, the inability to mobilize as they get older. They'll get more and more difficulty getting up on their feet and moving. Lonely people, lonelier they are, the more likely they're going to keep on smoking, less likely they are to quit smoking. They're less adherent, lonely folks are less adherent to dietary recommendations. So that could all contribute to the kinds of chronic diseases and ultimately the early mortality that you see in lonelier people. Sleep quality, I've mentioned sleep, and loneliness does seem to affect sleep. You get less quality sleep, so you don't feel rested when you wake up in the morning, more sleep disturbances, and we know that because we can put sleep sensors, you could say, where we're monitoring not only their eye movement, but also are they getting mini awakening periods during the night where they might be moving at a time when most people would be stably non-moving sleep, in stable non-moving sleep. And oftentimes it's not affecting differences in sleep duration. They're spending the same amount of time actually sleeping, but the quality isn't doing it for them. And that matters because of all the things we know about sleep duration itself, but sleep interruption, sleep quality being poor hampers our body's ability to repair and restore in preparation for the next day. So all of these things, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cognitive decline, dementia, poor mental health, poor health behaviors, poor sleep quality, with perhaps the one exception, the poor health behaviors, these all arise from what's called inflammation. Inflammation internally. These are the processes in the body that, if it was on your skin, let's say you had poison ivy and you had inflammation, you'd give somebody cortisol and to calm down the inflammation. Internally, cortisol seems not to be as effective at dampening inflammation inside the artery walls, inside the brain, wherever the part of the body is that's being affected. Inflammation is driving it. And the inflammation, in fact, drives a lot of the chronic diseases of aging. Back in 2020, just before the shutdown, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine put out this study report that pointed this problem of social isolation and loneliness to the healthcare system. So there is a very deliberate attention being paid this topic by people in healthcare, public health, as well as in hospitals, physicians' practices, whatever they can learn about, whatever we can research to help understand what's happening and what we can do about it is being now enacted, thanks in a large part to this stimulating study report. So who is at risk for loneliness? I've mentioned that not everybody is equally likely to have an ongoing problem with it or even to be repeatedly experiencing bouts of loneliness. But you know from the way the age distribution looked that loneliness decreased from 50 to about 75, and then it went up again. So what's that all about? Well, in older adults, it's physical health. So not only does loneliness lead to poor physical health has a reverse effect where it can actually increase your risk of becoming lonely. Maybe because you're isolated, if you've become unable to walk, you can't get outside of the house, maybe that constrains your social life and that does contribute to your loneliness. Pain will have its own kinds of effect on maybe the quality of your interactions. Maybe you can't really enjoy interactions when you're having to cognitively manage pain at all times. Sensory impairment, that's pretty self-evident. If you can't hear well, it's going to impact on the quality or even whether or not you're able to have interactions with other people. And even vision can be a problem. And that became true in part, I think, highlighted by the pandemic, because again, we were seeing each other on a screen, but we didn't see the whole person. We didn't get a feel for body language and all the other cues that we might get in a normal face-to-face interaction. And it affects how we relate to and how close we feel to the people if we don't get those multiple channels of information from people. There are also psychological and cognitive factors. So just as loneliness gives rise to anxiety and depression, contributes to cognitive decline, the same can be said of the reverse. Cognitive decline can affect your ability to interact. Anxiety and depression impact your, not only your ability to interact, but even your interest and your willingness to go out of the way to talk to people. Social and cultural factors are risk factors. So being married is typically protective, but it's not a 100% thing. There are married people who are just as lonely as people who are not married. It's often related to the quality of the marriage. Living arrangements. Living alone is great for people in the Nordic countries, in the Scandinavian countries. That's their cultural value. Independence, individualism, they take care of themselves, and they're fine with living alone. The same living arrangement in Spain and Portugal for older adults is lonely making. They don't want to be alone. It's not the norm. And that's part of the explanation for why there are differences. You'd expect that the Scandinavian people would be lonelier because they're in this dark, gloomy place and they're so independent and they're not schmoozing with their neighbors and family members. But in fact, it's the other way around. And there are disruptive life events, of course, that will trigger loneliness, whether that's bereavement or even retirement. Retirement doesn't necessarily have a long-term effect. It might be that what we've seen in some research is that when people initially retire, they have sort of a burst of joy, that the job is behind them, everything's fine. And then as they try to settle into their new life, they realize what they don't have and what they have to work at to recover. Maybe that's a social circle that they took for granted through work connections and all the activities related. And so that might actually reverse for them and they might become lonely. Or people make decisions on the basis of retirement. Oh, I'm going to move to the other end of the country and just see sun year round, without taking into consideration that they're leaving behind their whole social network. And now they're really alone in this new environment. And it really depends on their resilience and their ability to establish new relationships as to whether that's going to be a good decision for them. Demographic factors, typically men are somewhat more likely to suffer from loneliness. People with lower education, people lower on the socioeconomic ladder in general are going to be at greater risk for loneliness. During COVID, let me just take a look at the time here. This is, again, the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. And we looked at this data. This was in, I think, September of 2020, and we were looking at changes in loneliness from 5 years earlier. So the blue bars are 5 years earlier, 2015 to 16, and the purple bars are 2020, COVID. The first set of two relates to one of those questions about loneliness, just about lacking companionship, at least sometimes. Not a big difference. In fact, slightly fewer reported lacking companionship during the pandemic than before. Feeling left out. Fewer felt left out during the pandemic than 5 years earlier. Where the difference came in is in the question, didn't really surprise us when we thought about it, is many more felt isolated, at least sometimes during the pandemic, than they did 5 years earlier. I think that's what you would expect to see, given that every admonition during COVID to be safe was to isolate, self-isolate, isolate. That word came out again and again. And yeah, they did feel isolated in addition to being isolated. But then we looked at what did people do to compensate? There was a lot of talk about, well, let's improve the frequency with which people use video calls so that you can have these interactions and you actually see the people you're talking to. Or maybe they're phoning people more often or using messaging, whether that's email or text or social media, some kind of messaging platform. And we did ask these questions both about family members and about friends. So if you look at loneliness, these bars going across for decreased in-person contact, which was what most people did on the advice of CDC and others. You don't want to increase your exposure. To the extent possible, you're going to decrease it. To the extent you decrease it, you really increase your loneliness score. It's going up from this 0 line. And that was what we call a significant increase. It was a sizable increase. Well, what about if you just hold constant the fact that people gave away some of their in-person time, but they increased their phone contact, their messaging contact, their video call contact? Did that help? No significant effect. And if anything, it looks like slightly more lonely the more often, if you increased your phone contact, you're more lonely. If you increased your video call contact, actually probably nothing here, but if anything, it's going the other direction. And the same kind of thing happened with friend contact, even bigger effect. If you decreased your contact with friends, in-person contact, that really increased your loneliness. Only in this one did we see a bit of a tendency to have a protective effect. If you simultaneously compensated by increasing how often you interacted with your friends, showed a bit of a decrease in loneliness. But really the take home of it was that at least at the rates older adults in NCHAP were using these technologies, it did not make up for what they gave up in in-person contact. So this is where I'll end with some ideas about how do we reduce loneliness? How do we improve a sense of connectedness? This is the cover of the Surgeon General's advisory that we were pointing to before. From a public health perspective, the Surgeon General had a variety of recommendations. But I think in terms of a local, not a public health, but a local or more personal health basis, we might want to do things like this. I'm using this as an example, a meta-analysis. Again, I value these. Most scientists do like these because we're not showing you one study, which is unique in its own little way, and say, yes, it has an effect. And then they use the same intervention in another study and they find it has no effect. It's like getting an ad or a news blurb that says butter is good for you, and a year later, butter is bad for you. That's that kind of thing. So a meta-analysis puts all of that mess together and said, where's the weight of the evidence? Is it actually more likely to be this or that? And these are the types of therapies that had some kind of effect that was beneficial in reducing loneliness. Animal therapy. This isn't used a lot, but if people who are amenable to getting a pet, let's say, get a pet, that can be good for them. Of course, it's not for everybody. And that's part of the reason why, and I think the Surgeon General made this point too, there is no one size fits all here. People get lonely for different reasons. They are relieved of loneliness in different ways, and we have to be sensitive to that diversity. Cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy. Remember how I told you that loneliness is a mismatch between what you want and what you're getting out of your relationships? Well, one way to resolve that is to change your expectations. Maybe you're being unrealistic. Maybe you're misinterpreting. You go to the grocery store and you try to talk to the cashier and she just grumbles. What are you thinking? What are you thinking? Are you thinking, it's me again? Nobody says anything nice to me. It's just always negative. I'm just going to give up. Or can you say, she must have had a bad day or something happened to her, and I wonder if I can just have something to make her feel better. And those kinds of perspectives make a difference in how you perceive how well you connect, how well you feel you belong. Technological interventions, particularly in long-term care facilities. And I say that because what you just heard me say about NCHAP with the community dwelling older adults, it didn't matter whether they increased phone calls, video calls, messaging, social media, email. All of those device-mediated interventions did not compensate. They do seem to work better in long-term care facilities. And I think in large part, the way people who have done these studies understand this is that there isn't a lot of choice in a long-term care facility. And that some of these interventions are particularly effective for people who lack other means of and other places to connect with others. Plus, they have in-house help with the actual technology. The technology could be a barrier for having these kinds of programs work effectively. Multi-component exercise programs, again, in long-term care facilities. And that refers to not just the same old exercise every day, but one type of exercise mixed with another type of exercise done in this context versus that context. There's a lot of ways of mixing it up to make it interesting. And then just in general, this particular study, I like meta-analysis. This is meta-analysis of a meta-analysis. So it's a very top level review of what's out there in the research. And in general, they summarized all these research intervention approaches by saying the best were those that were either multi-component, lots of variety of things, or were group programs relative to one-on-one. So in their experience, their review of these interventions among community dwelling older adults, they would advocate for these group approaches rather than one-on-one, let's say psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not going to give up on cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy because of this, because that there is room, because this is not a one-size-fits-all game. There will be opportunities and occasions where a one-on-one approach is good. But in this case, in general, they were advocating for group programs. Here's an example of a multi-component intervention. Some of you here might be part of Silver Sneakers. This was a study that looked at people who were Silver Sneaker members and had enrolled in a program for at least 6 months. So they were active in some kind of physical activity in their local gym or wherever the Silver Sneakers program was being offered. And the study was to follow those people for 6 months and compare them to a similarly eligible group that had not yet enrolled. What were they like 6 months later? And what they found was that the Silver Sneaker enrollees were more physically active, less isolated, and indirectly less lonely than those who did not enroll. So that is multi-component, as in it's dealing with both providing an exercise and providing social contacts. And that has had a nice effect at 6 months. Another example is nutrition and isolation. So in this case, it was a study of Meals on Wheels programs, 8 of them across the country. They looked at what happened to seniors receiving these meals after 15 weeks of follow-up. So those who randomly received not randomly, they received meals, but a matched group that were eligible but were still on the wait list, they did not show that reduction in loneliness over 15 weeks. It's only those who got the meals. What was interesting in particular was this dose effect response. So those who got daily delivered meals were more likely to report improvements in loneliness than those who got those meals every week, which suggests to me, and the authors would have agreed, I don't think they measured how much social contact there was, but I think daily delivered meals assured recipients that they saw somebody at least every day. And without that, they may have been completely isolated for a week at a time. So there's my no one size fits all quote. Hence the need to tailor interventions to suit the needs of individuals, specific groups, or the degree of loneliness experienced. So we need to know what intervention works for whom, in what context, and how. That's a job for us. So you can't expect that you're going to have all of the answers just waiting to be delivered to you, but if you have the capacity and the interest and you want to be systematic about finding a way to reduce the problem or prevent the problem of loneliness in your community, consider doing it in conjunction with a researcher and actually providing some learning, some data that show what works for whom and when and how. I wanted to briefly mention this framework, the socio-ecological framework for loneliness. I'm on the scientific advisory committee for the Foundation for Social Connection. And this is not a foreign model, but we used it in this case specific to dealing with loneliness and social isolation in society, and taking it all the way from the individual. There are things we need to do as individuals to reduce our own risk and to find our ways out of loneliness. Interpersonal kinds of relationships that need to be tended. If you have a bad relationship, a conflictual relationship, a stressful relationship with someone that is really weighing down your satisfaction with your social life, what can be done about that? Do you fix that relationship? Do you shed that relationship? Whatever might be needed, that's part of that navigation of the interpersonal realm. Institutional, community level, societal level, and we do it everywhere. We do it in the education system, starting at childhood. I think a lot of times we're dealing with loneliness as a continuation of a problem that began much earlier in life. Deal with it in nutrition, in work, in housing. Every aspect of our life has a social component, and every aspect, therefore, has an opening for us to enter and intervene as possible. More than anything, not facilitate greater isolation and loneliness. And for that, I like this quote from what was the first Minister for Loneliness in the UK, and her colleague. Government can't make our friends for us. And ultimately, the challenge of creating a more connected society lies with each of us in our families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. But what government can do is help strengthen the foundations of society so that it becomes more natural and easy to chat, to share, and to trust each other. And there's the burden for us. I think in today's society, this is particularly challenging. So that's where I will invite questions, and I'll try to catch up on what we have in comments.
I missed your contact information. Would you mind putting it up again, please?
Sure. I'm not sure I understand Russ Alexander's question. How do you categorize time spent on social media? How do you count that? That is a good question, because it's also an area that is under very concerted study by some communication researchers, because the kind of data you see out there right now really lumps everything together. Social media. It's not all the same. So some people use social media for very personal reasons. They're making very directed comments with and having interactions with family members that are just supplementing relationship time that they have with them otherwise. Other people use social media for political reasons or for finding strangers that they might want to shoot the breeze with. That's all discrete types of interactions that may have very distinct effects on one's sense of connectedness and belonging. And it is hard to do that well, especially when the social media companies don't freely share that kind of information. So you have to count on people's self-report, and that tends to be iffy. There's a question about reducing inflammation. Yes, meditation, mindfulness are all supposedly good at that. This is not my area of specialty to talk about inflammation per se, but it is true that, for instance, and here's another intervention. There was a mindfulness intervention that was conducted by somebody who studies inflammatory processes in the body. It was kind of building on research I did with another a colleague in California, where we looked at gene expression, and we found that lonely people showed, you might call it an activation, an upregulation of a certain set of genes that were distinct from the genes of those who weren't lonely. And those genes were coding for inflammation. And so the intervention to be mindful in meditation actually improved not only their stress levels, but it changed gene expression. It relaxed those pro-inflammatory genes, and they went back to sort of a resting state, if you want to call it that. So there are processes like meditation that can help. Yeah, and dining by myself in Slovakia, people nearby would not let me eat alone. Yes, I like that. And I think that's an interesting, you might say, transition for me to think about how this plays out in other cultures and other countries. We do have a very individualistic sense in this country, and that does prevent us, without us even thinking about, prevent us from taking advantage of serendipitous connections that we could be making. It wouldn't have to be with people we know. It reminds me of a colleague here at the University of Chicago, Dr. Nick Epley, who did a study with our local train service. It's a commuter train that runs between the south suburbs and the university. When they got on the train, randomly they were told to sit where you usually sit, do what you usually do. The other group, they got a little, well, everybody got these instructions on a little piece of paper. Strike up a conversation with the person sitting beside you. And I don't know about in Philadelphia, but in Chicago, when you enter the train, you are a world to yourself. You don't talk to anybody. You don't look at anybody. You're on your way to work, period. People may not have liked it, but they measured their happiness, their satisfaction with that interaction before and after, whether they wanted to do or not. They found they felt better having had that social interaction with a complete stranger than if they just sat there doing their normal thing. So why aren't we doing that more often? Why don't we learn from that? It does feel good. And I think, if in Slovakia they are very sensitive to inclusion, I think we can learn from that. Why not? What have we got to lose?
I have a couple of questions for you on your slides. This is Brian. There are two things. One is, although there's a difference between gender, there's really not, there's a slight difference, but the pattern's identical.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can, scientists can spend the next quarter century trying to understand why the differences, that slight difference is there.
Yeah.
My question is about the shape.
Yeah.
And what's causing the shape, because I don't think you really touched on that.
No, I didn't.
We see from middle age down to retirement on that slide that actually loneliness decreases, and then it increases and ultimately exceeds the level of middle age as you get to 95, which was kind of the end age of the study period.
Right.
So my question is, what's causing the decline in loneliness?
Yeah.
And then what causes the reversal of that? Because if you talked about it, I missed it.
I didn't, and I can, because that same study, we actually did look at the factors that contributed to that increase at the end. And essentially what we found is a couple of things: whether you were married or not, and whether you were disabled or unhealthy, seriously unhealthy with many chronic conditions. If you weren't married, had these chronic conditions, were disabled, you were likely to see that big spike in loneliness. But if you didn't, if you managed to keep a spouse, maintain your health, maintain your mobility into old age, you did not see that increase. It essentially flattened right out. It did not increase like it would for those who were sicker.
So what you said makes an enormous amount of sense. Mobility, it's at least as you age, it's all about mobility. If you aren't mobile, you don't have interactions with people. You can't get out of your, I mean, you don't even have an interaction with the pharmacist because you have to have everything delivered, so to speak.
Right.
So there are, in a sense, two curves. I mean, the curves may still combine in the end because at a certain age point,
Yeah.
but there are two curves. One for those that are able to age more gracefully, more healthfully, and still have mobility and interactions versus those that can't.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
So why I have a theory, but why the decline from age 45 to say age 65?
Yeah, let me show you a few other things then. In this slide, we've broken that U-shaped curve up. So here, men and women combined, here's that U-shape with a little bit of a dimple in this blue one, but basically there's that U-shape, looking just at age. Now we're looking at when people were born, so a cohort effect. Is it really age, or is it because people who were born in 1920 are lonelier than those who were born in 50? And then we're looking at when they're measured. Maybe there's something unique about a certain period of time, like 2010 was after the Great Recession. Does that having anything to do with it? And we don't see any evidence of that. The only thing that's really clear is this age-related curve. As to the cause of it, I'll make it more complicated. This is a picture of age 20 through 100. This is using a German sample. There is a US sample, the General Social Survey, that looks very much like this. We in NSHAP caught this downward from about age 50. We caught this downward piece and then the rest where it goes up. But you can see even before that, there are dips and troughs. And these are the topics of discussion. What is going on that there is an increase between age 20 and 30? Then why is it decreasing 30 to 40? And then why is it increasing from 40 to 50? There's a lot of unanswered questions because loneliness tends to have been studied primarily in older adults and now increasingly in younger adults because there's such a growing prevalence of loneliness there. We don't have good answers. We tested a number of ideas. One was maybe it's unique to those people who reach a certain age and haven't reached or achieved the age normative goals of their life. Let's say they're age 30 and they aren't yet married and everybody else their age is married. Maybe that makes them feel lonely. Or maybe it's to do with work-related achievements where you don't fit the norm. Not a lot of clear evidence for that. So it's an open topic. By the way, this pink and blue is different. In this case, the pink and the solid line is just raw loneliness taking off at about age 80. The dotted line adjusts for the fact that some people have lost a spouse, lost their mobility, and so on. And so it's dropped right back down. It's even lower than it was in young adulthood.
So I have a theory on the left-hand side of on the pre-60 side, or on the 60 to 75, and that theory may also fit the 30 to being surrounded by people is not necessarily not being lonely. So having a spouse, you can have a spouse and be very lonely.
Yes.
Call an unhappy marriage. You can have children and feel very lonely because you actually have no social. I don't have children, but you hear people complain about it. There's no interaction with anybody else because your life is so totally consumed between work and taking care of your children.
Right.
And so if you look at that middle age to past retirement into the 70s, several things happen. One is the children are gone.
Yes.
And, I mean, I know this from my parents. This might be a very middle class kind of view of the world, but I know that from my own parents and from people that are, when we all left, they they went traveling.
Yes.
They joined club because we were gone, and they had more money because they weren't paying college tuition and things like that. You know,
And
you're
then
at
you
your
have to
peak of
deal
your
with
earnings.
conflictual relationships with teenagers.
Yeah, and you know, you got to dinner with your neighbors and your friends, and
Right.
and join a golf group or a bowling club or whatever it is that's your thing. Okay.
Mhm.
Because you're not tied down home, and that, you know, that could be
No,
being
that's,
home surrounded by 4 kids. People may still feel lonely when the
yeah,
kids, after you adjust to the fact that the kids have left, a lot of people's lives flourish until, and then you made the very good observation, until they then become, quote, disabled. They get other factors which reduce their ability. Those things start to drop off because they can't go out as easily.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. When I talk about not knowing what is happening, we're often constrained by the data we have in hand. So we might have interesting questions, but we can't answer them with the data that we have in hand. So it would take perhaps looking at a less representative national sample, look at a more local sample where we have more intensive data, and we could actually test that. But that's a very reasonable hypothesis. But I do think it's worth saying, as you did, a middle class, it might be a very white way of looking at how these things unfold. And so what we haven't done here in Germany, there isn't much diversity, but in the United States, we could certainly start looking at variation among racial ethnic groups.
And ethnic groups in the sense of, I mean, what I don't know is that how this changes generationally. So if you get to the 4th generation or the 3rd generation or whatever, whether it fundamentally changes. But there are certain ethnic groups where you still have, at least early in when they settle, you have multi-generational families.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's sometimes it's due to failures in the family structure, in that grandkids are being raised by grandparents.
Yeah.
And in some cases it's a societal thing where, you know, the children and the grandchildren are sort of socially forced to take care of the older generation, and everybody lives in the same household. I mean, it's different in different cultures. And so again, you're right. If you have a very broad study like that, you don't filter out for those different characteristics.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the other thing is, the point I was really trying to make is the definition of loneliness is not that you're not surrounded by a lot of people. You
Right.
can be very lonely and be surrounded by a lot of people.
Right.
Because people can be very isolated. It can force you to isolate yourself.
Yeah. And if you look at online sort of memes about this, like Robin Williams, Princess Diana, you know, constantly surrounded by people, but
Right.
among the loneliest people around.
Right.
So I will have the last question, Dr. Hawkley, and so one of the first things we do here at Penn's Village before we do anything is we try to see how we can cause an interaction between people. And I think that's one of the big takeaways, that it's not a one size fits all, but it's the interaction and the contact between people that helps. Am I correct on that?
Yes. And you have to start somewhere, and this psychological axiom of mere exposure, you can't get anywhere without at least starting to have that exposure and that contact.
Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of Penn's Village, I just want to thank you for making us smarter and giving us such a insight into this topic, which is so important to us and one of our missions here at Penn's Village. So thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom today. We truly appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome, and good good luck to you. Best wishes as you work to make your mission reality.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.